Hi everyone, I'm Dan Carroll, co-founder, chief product officer at Clever, and in a prior life, I was a teacher and a tech director in Denver. Today, I'd like to welcome you to our fourth and final episode of season 2 of Elevating EdTech, the series where we get to learn from industry leaders about critical issues for growing EdTech companies. Today, I'm so excited to have Michelle Brown as my guest for this episode because, as one recent article put it, she's built, quote, an education nonprofit that's grown as fast as Facebook. And in growing CommonLit, one secret weapon that Michelle's deployed is building powerful content partnerships. So I can't wait to ask her to tell us the CommonLit story. But first, I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping details. Today, I'm going to kick off by asking Michelle some questions I'm curious about, and that'll take about the first 30 minutes. Then we'll hand the mic over to you, our audience. So please submit questions via the webinar tool, or if you'd like to go to the front of the line, tweet your questions at Clever using the Elevating EdTech hashtag. Additionally, if you've got your notebooks and pencils out and are furiously scribbling, you can relax and sit back. This session is being recorded, and before the end of this week, we'll send you an email with a recording and a link to YouTube. So don't worry too much about the note-taking. But please do be thinking, what do you want to ask Michelle? We'll be spending a lot of time today answering your questions. All right, we got the logistics out of the way. So Michelle, it is so great to have you on Elevating EdTech today. How are you doing?
Good. Can you all see and hear me?
We can see you and we can hear you. So Michelle, your first job out of college was teaching middle school reading in the Mississippi Delta. How did you make your way from the Delta to being a EdTech nonprofit founder in Washington, D.C.?
It wasn't a very direct path, but so I taught for 2 years with Teach for America in rural Mississippi. And then after I finished my core experience, I decided to continue teaching 7th grade reading, but in the Uncommon Schools Network in Boston. And so I was at, a school that had resources and where I was observed every day, and that had a lot of institutional knowledge and great processes and curriculum, and a lot of mentorship. And so Uncommon really poured resources into my development. I taught there for the next 2 years. And then I was sort of at a point in my career where I was thinking, like, I want to do something bigger and I want to scale up, I want to affect more than just 100 kids. And so I went to get my policy master's degree. And I was about 1 week into my policy master's program and went to my academic advisor and was just like, I've made a terrible mistake because I think that policy moves super slowly and I'm extremely impatient. And I think that there are students today that are sitting in classrooms that do not have the basic materials that they need to learn how to read and write. And just I can't wait for us to pass new legislation. And he said, it sounds like you should be an entrepreneur. And so I was kind of like, ooh, I don't know, that seems really hard. And he said, well, how about this? Spend a week thinking about your idea and then come back and pitch me. And it was sort of like an assignment. And I just took that assignment and it was the kick in the pants that I needed. I had a domain name within 2 days. I had a business plan on a napkin. And I was sort of off to the races.
I love that. And like the founders of Facebook, did you drop out of Harvard or did you stick it out and take your master's degree?
I thought about it, but no, I actually used my graduate school experience and used the resources at Harvard to basically just launch CommonLit. It was really, really nice in retrospect having that year. And I think my professors are just so sick of me writing literally every graduate school paper about CommonLit. I would try to weave it in. And then I did an independent study.
That's really cool. It actually maybe reminds me of the Teach for America founding story, how it was the senior thesis for Wendy Cobb. Um, Michelle, one of the things I talk to early stage ed tech founders all the time about is what does the first version of their product look like? What is their MVP that they can release out into the world to get feedback to kind of know if they're on the right track or if they need to make some changes to their idea? What was the MVP for CommonLit? What did the very first version that you showed to someone other than your professor look like?
It was super embarrassing, but so important, which I've heard is like, actually, if you're not embarrassed by your first thing, then you might be doing it wrong.
Yeah.
But the first version of CommonLit was a Google Drive. It was lessons and texts that I had found that I created. And it was just the CommonLit Google Drive. And actually that MVP, minimum viable product, was minimally viable enough to the point where it enabled me to run a quasi-experiment with 222 students and prove in the early stages CommonLit's effectiveness in a pre-post. And that study, the quasi-experimental design, enabled CommonLit to win a $4 million Department of Education federal grant 3 years later.
That is an incredible story, because what I hear often from entrepreneurs is I hear, well, I have this really great idea, but I can't launch it until I raise a bunch of money and hire a bunch of expensive engineers, and then I can show it to someone. And, oh, you know, the idea of running an efficacy study, I can't do that for 3 years until I, you know, get enough money to spend millions on a company. But it sounds like you were able to launch your product to schools and test its efficacy, you know, before you raised any money. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point, you know, I think I had like maybe $500 invested into CommonLit, something like that. I mean, that's really all it takes.
Yeah.
And like my whole life in sweat and blood. So whatever that is worth, and all of my weekends in graduate school. But yeah, it's totally possible.
I love that. You know, you can ship an MVP and test its efficacy with $500 and, you know, a lifetime of learning how to become a great. So
right.
One of the things that I think really distinguishes CommonLit is how quickly you were able to grow post that MVP stage. You know, the Facebook-like growth. What were the factors that led to that early growth early on that were able to allow you to kind of take the country by storm?
Yeah, so we, interestingly, and much to the surprise of everyone, including myself, spread rapidly and virally through teacher networks at a point where, I mean, we literally had no marketing team. It was like me and 2 other people, and none of us were really getting paid. And I think we spread for a few reasons. I mean, I think one thing is that we had something that was good. It was high quality. And I think one of the things we did right was just early on in the design, which like came from that research study that I did, is grounded the whole platform in like a handful of instructional best practices, literally teacher moves that we know make a difference for students. And we like the whole design of CommonLit, you know, even from the PDFs, were designed to nudge teachers to incorporate those best practices, like teaching vocabulary, for example.
Yeah.
And I think the other reason we grew so fast was just influencers. And then sort of in our medium stage, interoperability.
Well, we'll definitely get to interoperability later on in the conversation, but I want to just highlight the way that you talk about research-based best practices. I think it's really unique. I know pretty much every edtech company out there says, oh, we're research-based. And maybe if you search their entire website, you might be able to find some research paper somewhere there. But I love the way that your blog post, and we'll email this out at the end, that really says like, hey, here are the 8 instructional practices that we've built CommonLit around, and here is the paper that describes how each one is a best practice and super effective and highly effective. You can see your master's degree right there in your instructional design, and I love it.
Yeah, nerd alert. Yeah, it totally pays off.
I'm proud to be signaling, you know, cause to go off. And as you were getting started with CommonLit, you made a decision that I think is a really cool one, to start the company or the organization as a nonprofit, not a for-profit company. In those early days when you were getting your master's degree, how did you make that decision? What was your thought process?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that I actually thought about this decision and had it be a decision, because I've talked to so many other founders that are just like, I didn't really know that a nonprofit was like a viable business model. And so I think that it's just like doesn't even sort of enter into the calculus. Um, but um, but anyway, I had pro bono legal counsel from like third year law school students at the university. And they were like, okay, here are all the types of ways you can incorporate. I was like, oh, tell me more about this nonprofit model. And after I started thinking about it, I realized what a strength it could be. And I've written about this a lot, but I think that especially in the early stages of building like an education platform specifically, you do have to make something that is highly effective. And that's, just, and that improves teaching and learning. And so instead of focusing on sales or, pitching VCs or things like that, we got to dedicate a lot of our early philanthropy just to making the tool really work.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree that there can be this really strong push for revenue if you're starting out as a for-profit company. What has it been like in terms of fundraising for CommonLit? You aren't talking to VCs, but instead you have to go to foundations and other folks to raise money to support your growth. What have those conversations been like?
Yeah, so fundraising is something that is a big part of especially a founder's like life. And I would say that it's still about maybe 30 to 40% of my time. But most of CommonLit's revenue right now, or philanthropy, is actually government and corporate. And so we don't have a lot of like individual philanthropy, or although that is a growing, and foundation philanthropy. But I would say, just like anything, the first pitches are the hardest, or getting the first, I'm sure it's the same in the VC world, getting that first person to believe in you is the hardest thing. And it's often a lot about the founder and the team and just like how compelling or committed you are. And then after that, I think it's more about the impact and the results.
Yeah, and for you even, right, one of the key parts to your initial funding from the federal government was from your research, right, the impact that you were having.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the things that I really love the most about CommonLit is the depth of your content. Looking at the program or the website from a teacher perspective, you can pick content for your classroom based on the theme or genre, the literary devices in the reading passages, or even you can have a whole set of content that pair with certain novels you might be reading as a class. Mm-hmm. And to get to that level of content depth, where for each of these categories, there's multiple articles that you can use and lesson plans, must have just taken a ton of work. And in particular, I'm wondering, how are you able to get rights to that much content? What was the sort of partnership strategy that you built to get all these really great articles and passages to be part of your product?
Yeah. So I think you touch on something which is really specific to CommonLit. So most of our partnerships today are content partnerships. And so one unique thing about CommonLit is that we don't just have texts that CommonLit writers write. We have some texts like that. But most of them are like original poems or, excerpts from like Malcolm Gladwell or Toni Morrison, things that we think are important for kids to read. And like, you just can't not introduce that to kids. And so for that, what that looked like in the early stages was just like tracking down the rights holders, which is just really scrappy. And you have to call publishing back houses and then get people to respond to you on LinkedIn. And it's just kind of like a wild goose chase. You have to find their agents sometimes. Sometimes you have to talk to their estate. And, just like anything, sometimes that you get a lot of no's. And so, what this looked like is this was a year with me in the early stages, sitting on my sofa and spending literally 9 to 5 or more, just like calling up publishers and getting no after no after no. But then you get a couple of yeses, and then success begets more success. And once like NPR donates some content, then you can probably call up the New York Times and it's more likely that they'll donate too.
That sounds so much like fundraising or
Mm-hmm.
hiring or so many of the other early challenges you have as a founder organization. I love that. And, I don't know, thinking about I'm sure there's some folks who are in early stage of their organizations on this webinar right now, and they're probably in that middle of that phase where they've only had no's. Maybe they've had 5 or 10, but they haven't heard a yes yet. What was it that kind of kept you going and asking when you'd received so many no's and you hadn't heard your first success?
What was it that kept me going? I think just a relentless person. I'm just extremely stubborn. And, I was just going to keep going no matter what. And I also just think, sometimes, my early team was really like Rob and Sarah, like the first 2 employees of CommonLit. We just laugh at ourselves a lot. There's a lot of like laughing in the early stages. And I think that if you're not doing that, then you're probably like not going to be able to sustain the work because it sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I thought a lot when I was getting lots of no's in the early stage of Clever was like, this is still easier than being a first-year teacher.
Oh, yeah, totally. I know.
Having somebody say, no, they're not going to buy Clever, or school districts say they're not going to adopt it yet, still way easier than
oh my gosh. Teachers are superheroes. It's like, oh God, I know. Yeah.
So sometimes I joke and tell startup founders, they're like, well, how do you keep going? How do you find the grit? I'm like, just go teach for a handful of years, and then starting a company will seem really easy. Mm-hmm. I love that. Well, Michelle, so you guys have really focused and done an amazing job of building these content partnerships, and had all these incredible authors donate the rights to their content to your product. But I'm sure those aren't the only kinds of partnerships that pop up on your radar. I'm sure now that you've reached such an incredible scale, actually, maybe we haven't talked about this yet. What is the scale of CommonLit like today? What are some of the stats you use to talk about your growth?
It's crazy. So I just read a stat on Slack and we were all just like eyeballs. So since August 1st, our average number of signups per day, and a lot of these are like Clever syncing. So, think about a teacher and a student. But the average number of signups per day on CommonLit this school year is 40,000. And last year it was like 21,000 or something like that on average per school day. But so, yeah, and it's just not slowing down. So yeah, that's crazy. But, one thing that, you mentioned partnerships, and we do have partnerships outside of content partnerships. And I did some pre-thinking about this because this is the title of the webinar after all. But so here's sort of the framework that I use when I'm evaluating a partner. One is mission fit. So like, will they help our mission? 2 is, do we have a shared pedagogical approach? So like, or will the partnership or us promoting them kind of confuse the message for teachers? And like, this is specifically about the best practices. Like, does it make it harder for teachers to do these best practices if we have like a new framework or something? And the 3rd is, could we do it better? So, like, is this something that we would want to, have on our platform, or maybe, in 5 or 10 years, like have a stake in it? And I think that this framework has let us say no to some partnerships, opportunities in the mid stages that I think could have taken us down a weird path or something like that. But that at the time we were like, oh my gosh, we can't believe these people like care about us that much. Like, are we actually talking to the CEO? And it like feels very exciting when these opportunities come across your desk. But I think like, this too, you just got to keep the main thing. And a lot of times that just means having the discipline to say no.
It's pretty crazy how quickly the switch flips, right? From, trying to get people on the phone and it being impossible and people ignoring you all the time, to all of a sudden the inbound that's coming and you're the person that's maybe harder to reach or having to say no to things.
Yes. Every stage is a different skill set for sure.
Totally. So what are some of the partnerships that have made sense, that have been mission aligned and maybe around areas that you said, hey, this isn't the core competency for CommonLit?
Yeah, so we've had partnerships with like other nonprofit organizations that could help us with scale or to sort of pilot our content with a new paradigm that we can study. And sometimes a lot of these, the best ones for us have been local, so that our usability team and product team can actually like go and observe. So that has been really interesting. Nonprofit organizations like after school programs and sometimes schools or districts. And then, yeah, like Clever, has really been transformative for us in terms of growth, especially. You probably have these stats, but I know like CommonLit might be one of the top Clever connecting apps, or maybe it was last year. I don't know if someone surpassed us, but in terms of the like mission alignment, we saw this as like a really important way for us to get to scale.
Yeah, I love the partnership that we built a little over a year ago. CommonLit had been growing this sort of teachers adopting model, but you were having more and more district usage, and we were able to help you with rostering. And you absolutely were. You were, I think, the number one growing app on Clever in 2018, and it was just pretty magical and explosive how many districts were turning CommonLit on in their Clever dashboards. Loved it. Yeah. It's still going on.
Yeah. It also matches our framework on the number 3 thing. Could we do it better? We were like, yeah, definitely not. Like we cannot be a rostering company.
Yeah. Well, you're making me blush. We got to move on. So one of the things that I've been really excited about lately is CommonLit moving from a model where everything was free to starting to add some new services that are paid. And I'm really curious to hear, first of all, how they're going. And what you've learned, but also how you thought about paid services in the context of being a nonprofit organization.
Yeah. So this is interesting because I had like, especially in maybe like the first 2 years of building CommonLit, was like really bullish, even when I was pitching foundations that were like, okay, so how are you going to sustain this? 5 years from now, are you going to keep hitting us up for money? And I was kind of like, well, yeah, because you're a foundation and literally your job is to give away money. And like, we want to be like roads on the street or the public library, like, like the pipes or infrastructure that people should continue investing in. And what we realized is that really just depending on, with any type of business that you're building, depending on like one stream of revenue is really risky and hard, and it's unpredictable. And so, we started thinking about what are services that we could uniquely provide that would also help with our mission. And it sort of came to us organically when we were getting like inbounds from school district leaders that were like, hey, I hear that my teachers are all talking about this thing called CommonLit. Like, can you like come down and do a training or sort of help us link this with like our bigger literacy initiative? And so, now we actually are in the middle of launching and piloting the CommonLit literacy model, which is a whole reading program for a district to adopt. It includes aligned assessments and curriculum and also coaching.
That's incredible. I want to pause for the conversation for just 1 second to remind everyone who's watching to please get your questions in for Michelle. You can again ask them through the Zoom webinar tool, but if you want to get to the front of the line, please send them to us via Twitter. You can tweet at Clever with the hashtag ElevatingEdTech. And hurry, we'll be turning to questions in just a few minutes. Michelle, I love that idea of diversifying your revenue and not becoming too dependent on foundations. I think the same thing goes for we've seen it in the news, right, with for-profit companies, that if you try to think you can live on venture capital money forever, You are definitely wrong. At some point, you really need to build a business that makes sense and makes cash. So I've just got two more questions for you. And the first one is, we've got a lot of early stage entrepreneurs who might be leading for-profit edtech companies or nonprofit edtech organizations watching right now. And what's the number one piece of advice that you would tell them to focus on in that early stage? Maybe they're 3 to 10 employees.
Yeah. So I've said this before, my main piece of advice is build your product. And what that means is just, especially in the early stages, and even like now, just focus all of your energy on making the product as good as it could be and proving that it works with a small group, or getting you need a super user. You need one school who's like your big success story. And I talk to so many founders that are sort of like, what should I be doing? Why is this not working? And I sort of say okay, tell me your typical day. How are you spending your time? And it's kind of like, oh, well, I'm talking to this person and, staying on top of industry trends. And then and they sort of realize through talking through, I'm like, well, what do you need to get to the next stage? It's like, well, if I just had, results or my first set of customers, proof of concept. And so I think that proof of concept is it's key. So build your product.
Yeah. Another piece of advice I think really resonates with that is do things that don't scale. I think a lot of people early on are like, well, how do I get 1 million users? And it's first you need to get 10 super, 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 super happy users. And once you have those, then you can start to think about how to get 100. Don't worry in the first year about how to get to 1 million users, because that's just going to do all sorts of things that you don't need to do yet.
Totally. It's have you heard the Airbnb founders when they left their accelerator program and flew to New York City and started knocking on doors, and they were like, could we photograph your house? But it worked.
Totally. No, that story was drilled into our heads right when we were starting Clever. Get close to your, build your product, talk to your users. That's the only thing you're allowed to do. That's what our advisors said. Don't even talk to your advisors. Just build.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, we're going to turn to questions in just a minute. So last reminder to get those questions in for Michelle. But before we do, Michelle, we asked you to share some of your favorite edtech reads, some of the books and podcasts and things like that that have really helped shape you as an entrepreneur that you recommend to others. So we're going to pull up a slide here, and we'd love to hear your description about some of your favorite edtech reads and resources.
Sure. So the first one is Crossing the Chasm. And so this is kind of it's about how technology products go to a mainstream market. And sort of the idea is that there's a chasm, there's a break from going from your early adopters to your mainstream customers and getting to scale. And then there are sort of the laggards, there's the early adopters who are the first people to buy Google Glass, and everybody's like, what are you doing? You're crazy. But who you really want to get to is the mainstream. But so this book is really interesting because it's about that middle point, which is kind of where we found ourselves at year 3. The second book is Radical Candor, which is actually, and I know at Clever too, is kind of now part of our codified organizational culture. I read this book, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago when we were hiring really fast, and sort of had made some early hiring mistakes. And I was sort of at a stage where I was like, I really need to define the culture of my company and make sure that people are getting feedback constantly, and that the feedback is really honest, and especially that there are no surprises when people are just not on track. So that this has been really transformative for the culture of CommonLit, where I think we tended to sort of like pull our punches with feedback a little bit across our leadership team.
The ruinous empathy, right?
The ruinous
That's
empathy.
what
Yeah, that was
sometimes that we don't actually give people the hard information they need.
totally, totally. And they were like, wait, you know, a lot of people were like, we're doing a bad job. I was like, okay, our whole management team needs to read this book. So, and then now this is the one that I'm actually, it's over here. I'm not totally done with it yet, but I'm done enough where I think it's worth recommending. So this is the Together Leader. And it's more about organizational management, strategic planning, project planning. And I love this because they're like example project planning templates and like screenshots of people's like Excel documents from like different change organizations like Teach for America. I think there's a lot. And then should I talk about the rest?
Sure, yeah, give us a quick overview.
Sure. So the Marshall Memo is, I think it's like $50 a year. It's a weekly briefing from a researcher, Kim Marshall, who just like reads all of the journals and summarizes all the latest education research in this like weekly Tuesday email, which is great. Our whole staff gets it. And then just a couple of podcasts that I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with.
Yeah, Startup is one of my personal favorites, especially season 1. That first time that their founder pitches an investor is like one of the best moments of audio I've ever heard.
I know. And then the How I Built This that just came out where they now sold to Spotify is really interesting.
Yeah, it's so cool to see this, on audio recording their journey of their startup from 2 people first figuring out, their salaries and their roles all the way to pretty incredible hundreds of millions of dollars exit.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we could talk podcasts probably for another hour or 2, but I think it is time to turn things over to our audience. So thank you to everyone who's asked a question so far. If you haven't yet, it's not too late. You can ask it in the Zoom tool or tweet it to get to the front of the line. And let's start with a first question from Roxanne via Twitter. Thanks, Roxanne. So Roxanne said that, Michelle, your content partnership story resonates with her and is inspiring, as she's tried so hard to make those partnerships, and they've always involved licensing fees that she hasn't been able to afford. So what have you been able to do to avoid licensing fees, and maybe what open resource content partners have you been able to find?
Yeah, so in the early stages of CommonLit, we also had to say no to, some particular short stories that were just like, way too expensive for us, or thousands of dollars, or we had to pay by view or something. And, especially for the really, really canonical texts, they're harder and they're going to be more expensive. I would say my one piece of advice is to think about emerging authors and emerging writers and trying to, and a lot of their stuff isn't digitized yet. Like you can't Google it. You have to literally buy the book and read it and scan it. And these are authors that are so excited to get their works in front of students and to have it be read. And these are usually like more affordable and really great.
And are we talking emerging authors like the author of The Hate You Give, that her first book turns into a mega blockbuster, or maybe folks that are a little bit less popular?
Yeah, probably not that successful yet.
That makes sense. And Michelle, you also use some public domain kind of historical texts as well. Is that right?
Oh, totally. Another thing that I just remembered is we started working with like the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress has these librarians and archivists that are, their whole job is to just like catalog the world's like amazing literature. And they have this like incredible expertise and can help you like dig up really good stuff that's public domain.
That's amazing. It's such a great recommendation. All right, thanks again for the great question, Roxanne. Next question is from Ryan, who said that influencers were helpful in sustaining the mid-stage growth for CommonLit. Can you speak a little more to the role of influencers at CommonLit and how you were able to get brand awareness and get in the door with them.
So this is a hilarious story. So Jennifer Gonzalez is like a blogger, like a teacher blogger. And I think she has a whole business now. But anyway, she has a huge following on Twitter. She's a podcast. And my mom, who lives in Texas, was like trying to help me and emailed Jennifer Gonzalez. It was because she was like, she has so many Twitter followers, and was like, Jennifer, you have to talk to my daughter, Michelle, and like interview her. She's building something really big. So so that summer I get a call from Jennifer. She's like, hey, your mom told me that like you're doing something really cool. And then she started looking at it. She's like, okay, this is actually really legit. And I'd love to invite you on my podcast. But yeah, I mean, you just got to like reach out to people. And, you know, my recommendation with that is that don't reach out until you're really ready. And, you know, the worst thing is to just, you know, people will sort of like make a snap judgment or look at something once. And you want to make sure that, you know, it's great.
That's awesome. Is your mom taking out any other clients for a tech PR or a tech PR role?
She just like outs me in so many random ways. She's like, oh, the school district leader. I mean, she's the best evangelist of all. So
that's amazing.
Your parents can help you too.
Yeah. One piece of advice that I've found from reaching out to these kinds of thought leaders or influencers is they get a lot of inbound, and so if you just kind of do a generic like copy and paste and send the same thing to 100 people, you're probably not going to get any results that are meaningful. But if you actually read their content, if you really understand what they're interested in, what their expertise is, and ask a really thoughtful question, I've had tremendous luck. Like, you know, 60 or 70% of people reply if I can really think about how what we're doing connects to what they're passionate about.
Yeah, no, totally. It's all about relationships.
Yeah. Cool. Next question is from Alexander. And Alexander asks, are you paying some of your content partners for content? And how has being a nonprofit influenced how they are able to work with you?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's a strength. And I think, you know, it's one competitive advantage we have is that, you know, we're not profiting off of the content, we're providing a free service. And so I think that because of that, a lot of people who just want their works to be read are more likely to be lenient with the kind of rights that they give us. So like, you know, to be able to like digitize and just make it freely and openly available. I think that it would definitely be harder to get that and negotiate that as a for-profit.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that you might have some challenges too, because literally anyone in the world can go to your website and see the passage. You're not putting anything behind a paywall. And so that might be a tough, you know, even though you're a nonprofit, the fact that you're so open probably makes things challenging too.
Yeah, totally. And so, you know, we do now have like some texts that are at least behind a paywall. And so or not a paywall, a login wall. We don't have any paywalls. So we know that it's like a verified teacher and a verified educator. So, you know, that is one thing that we have had to build.
Makes sense. All right, next question is from an anonymous audience member who's asking about advice for a company that offers a service or a suite of services where it's not so easy to isolate the impact in an efficacy study. Maybe that's because there's just a bunch of things going on, so it's not easy to figure out which part is having an impact. Any advice there, or maybe broadly speaking about how to run impact studies in an efficient and scalable way?
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of different study designs that are extremely valid. And one is just a case study. And it's, you know, there's actually like, I think like a scientific way to do a valid case study that doesn't have to do with anything with like an experimental design or quasi or isolating the, you know, people who have the intervention versus not, which I know is sometimes hard, even ethically, to say like, oh, can we just randomize this thing? A lot of schools will just be like, no, no, we can't. So, yep, that's one piece of advice. And my second is thinking about alternative like outcome measures that are not maybe like just achievement. You know, you could think about students' social emotional learning or surveys or things like that, which I think are increasingly being considered like just like valid and important ways to measure a child in a holistic way.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is make sure you do the pre-test. You know,
Yes.
when you get to that point where you feel like your product's really, really good, don't, you know, ask for the initial data before
Yes.
you give them access.
Get your baseline. Yeah, don't forget.
You've definitely
Totally.
made that mistake many, many times at Clever. Hopefully we've learned from it by now.
Yeah.
Jonathan has a really good question. He's asking, last year you wrote about the company culture and the CommonLit SLAY framework, SLAY. How important has that culture and that framework been for your growth?
Yeah, it was so important. So SLAY is sweat the details, learn and share, align yourself, and yield to the team. And this is, we actually evaluate like in our biannual review process. Everybody in our organization gets reviewed on the same rubric. And it's the SLAY rubric. And we have like 5 different levels of SLAY. And I think, you know, the one that I'll sort of highlight the most is learn and share. And especially during the growth stage, when you're adding a bunch of employees, you want people to sort of like replicate what they know. And otherwise, because what we realized is like, there are like 4 people here that have this like institutional and historical knowledge, and like, we need to pass that along. And so, you know, these things are not just like, you know, cool, you know, raw, like things that we have on our wall. Like they actually are pivotal to our organization's success.
Have you started thinking about them at all in your hiring process? Do you ask people questions to try to get at whether they have some of those attributes and beliefs?
So we do that very intentionally. And so it's like during the section of our interview process where it's like, tell me about a time when, and we ask a question and like really dig more into the like, are they really learning and sharing? You know, did they keep the knowledge for themselves? How did they like make sure, and that's just for the L, or like, how did they really sweat the details on something?
And how far along was CommonLit when you implemented those, that system? Was that?
Yeah, so I think we were maybe like 15 employees or something like that. We're 33 now. And it was like at a stage where I think we had, you know, we made some hiring mistakes, which happens when you're a startup. And I think the reason we made those mistakes is because we didn't have a defined culture. You know, people would be like, so during the interview process, like, so what's the culture of CommonLit? And we'd be like, what do you want it to be? Like, your resume is amazing. And then we kind of stepped back and we were like, no, actually, we really do have a culture here. And to be successful, they really need to like, you know, do these 4 things.
Yeah, I love that. We did it right around the same time. I think we were 20 people at Clever.
Yeah.
There actually is, you don't want to do this like, I don't think this is the right thing to do from day one, when it's just one, you know, founder or a few co-founders, because you want it to be like a real lived culture, not just like your ideas of like, I think it'd be really cool if you want to be like, well, what does bring us together? What are our shared values?
Yeah.
And it takes it having, you know, a little bit of a bigger team to get to that point where you actually are kind of living out those values every day.
Yeah. And sort of making some mistakes too. And then you're like, oh, this thing really does matter.
Yeah. So you have to boil it down to just a few things. We have, I think,
yeah.
5 and you have 4.
Yeah. What are Clevers? I'm curious.
So let's see if I can rattle them off quickly. We kind of, they all kind of a little bit cutesy names. So it's always a student, which I think is really similar to your work. Leave the classroom better than you found it. It's kind of about mission and improving classrooms. Don't trust the textbook. Question dogma, find a better way. do the extra credit, so kind of go above and beyond. And I always get to the point. And bring good vibes. Yeah, be a great teammate.
Oh, I love that. Those
Thanks.
are great. Yeah.
Yeah. We do a fun thing at our all hands where we sort of give people awards based on just more like shout outs, not no big prize, but based on people we saw kind of exhibiting those tenets in really cool ways throughout the week, which is really fun.
Yeah.
All right,
awesome.
we can again talk culture at edtech organizations for another hour or two, but let's get back to the questions. Really cool one from Eliana. Eliana wants to know, is there an ability for CommonLit classrooms from all over the world to connect with each other? Maybe it'd be really exciting if they could have virtual conversations with partner classrooms who are looking at maybe some of the same reading passages.
That would be so cool. And I will ask my product team. But no, right now, there's no way for anyone on CommonLit, any teachers to communicate to other teachers, or even to like other teachers or schools aren't visible. So there's no like community aspect to it. It's something we've been thinking about for a long time, is like, well, now that we have so many teachers, how could we build a community? And so we're sort of studying like, how are schools without technology collaborating around CommonLit, and for what purposes? Is it in the planning stages, like lesson planning and things like that? Or is it for like the thing that the person described, for more like, connecting like student to students?
Yeah, I love that you're starting not from a perspective of like, well, I think it'd be cool if schools did this, so I'm going to put this into the product, but instead kind of more of an observational approach, saying like, what are people already doing? Could we find ways to make that easier in our product? I think it's such a great way of thinking about product development. All right. I got a question from Raul, and then we also may have a few minutes for another question or two. So if you're still watching and excited to ask Michelle a question, we might have a room for just one or two more. So Raul seems to have really enjoyed this conversation and is saying, hey, Michelle, I'm looking for some mentorship. What is the best way to reach you for advice? And maybe I'll broaden that a little bit and just say, Michelle, I'm sure a lot of people ask you this. How do you think about your ability to support the kind of edtech community, and how do you find the right ways where you can be helpful to folks?
Yeah, definitely. So I love helping early stage founders in the education space, especially early stage founders that are starting nonprofits, because I think that that's just so needed with mentorship in the space. And so I would encourage like anyone who does have a nonprofit and that's early stage in the education space, you could reach out to me directly at michelle@commonlit.org. And admittedly, I'm busy, but I try my best to help whenever I can help. And then, for other folks, I write about our culture and a lot also on the CommonLit blog. So I'd encourage them to go there and sort of check out the resources. And Dan, I can also like send over any resources to you as a follow-up, like our Slay blog post or things like that I think could be helpful for other founders.
That's perfect. Yeah, we'll follow up offline, and we'll make sure that the greatest hits make it into the email we'll send out to all the participants today. Well, I want to ask you a personal question. We also think have maybe one or two more coming from the audience. My first one is, I'm about to have my first baby with my partner, and you are a recent new mom. What's your advice to folks who are trying to start and grow an early organization, but also growing a family at the same time? How have you found a way to balance it? Because I know I'll need your help and your advice.
No, this is so James, my son, is 1. He is 14 months old. And it has completely changed our lives for the better. But, it was really tricky. I came back and we had thankfully, CommonLit, because I run it, has a really nice maternity leave policy. Yeah. And so, I took time off and really connected with being a mom. But the transition back to work, I think is a thing that people don't talk a lot about. It was extremely jarring for me, from going from like, intimate, like, in the nursery, like every day for every hour of the day, to sort of like, seeing James like maybe 2 to 3 hours a day or something like that during the week. And so I think my biggest recommendation is just like, find your like parent friend or whoever it is that is kind of like maybe in a similar stage or something that could just kind of walk you through things. I think the other thing, just as general advice, is sort of, you kind of have to forgive yourself a lot. I think that there are so many times where, I think I tend to be like maybe a perfectionist or something. I'm like, I need to make James like an organic homemade like pack lunch and everything. And I sort of have to step back sometimes and just be like, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay if he eats like baby food from the jar. And so, it's just kind of all about balance.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think if you, maybe for a future kid, or if you could go back in time, would you maybe phase work back in, like start part-time before you go full-time back to work?
I think so. Yeah. I think I would kind of maybe start joining a couple more meetings sort of slowly, or maybe like go into the office here and there a little bit more. And maybe even, just do sort of like a tiered phase in.
Yeah. Well, that's very practical and relevant advice for me, and hope this
So exciting. I can't wait to see all the pictures.
They will be, they'll be blowing up your inbox for sure. All right, I think we've got our final question for the day from Jonathan, who said that CommonLit appears to be mostly focused on the US school and district market. Do you have any plans for international expansion?
Yeah, so we actually do have a 3-person team in Mexico City today. And it's through a grant that we got funded through google.org. And so that has enabled us to just basically, honestly, just like learn what it means and what it would take to scale internationally, and just focusing on like one country. And I don't think that, I think that sometimes the paradigm is like US, then all other countries. And I would encourage people to think country by country, because it's just, such a different context, and the assumptions you have just don't port.
Yeah, I love that. And when you think about international expansion, will that be CommonLit in helping folks read and develop skills in their native language, or do you think it'll be kind of an English platform to learning English around the world?
Yeah, my vision is both. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, Michelle, this has been so much fun. I've learned so much. Thank you so much for spending some of your very precious time to share your wisdom with our wonderful audience today, who's had some fantastic questions. We really, really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you so much for thinking about me, Dan. And if I don't see you before your parental leave, good luck. And can't wait for you guys.
For the audience, this is our last Elevating EdTech of this season, but it's been a blast. So we will certainly be coming back with some new content and some interviews in 2020. So stay tuned. Like we mentioned, you'll get an email in the next few days with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as some of the resources Michelle has mentioned. And if you have any questions for me or folks at Clever, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm dan@clever.com. And if you get it in the next 2 to 3 weeks, you should get a prompt response. After that, I might be in baby mode. Well, thank you all for attending, and biggest thanks to Michelle. So great to spend an hour chatting with you, Michelle.
This was really fun. Have a good one. Bye, y'all.
Bye.